Hello, my name is Greg Meyer. I'm the County Extension Educator for Ag and Natural Resources in Warren County. I've been the Extension Educator in Warren County for about 25 years. Welcome to the virtual Farm Science Review and your Utzinger Garden Horticulture Talks. This morning I'm going to be talking to you about overcoming the challenges for growing backyard fruit in Ohio. So let me share my screen with you and we'll get started with this presentation. So my background is an extension educator. I've had the opportunity to teach many classes on growing backyard fruit to not only homeowners but also to master gardeners across the state. It's one of the topics that I teach in a lot of different places. I also have the opportunity to work with our local specialty crop growers for our Southern Ohio Specialty Crop Conference. So I'm pretty involved in the specialty crop markets with regard to fruits and vegetables from that end. And this is a topic I do particularly enjoy talking to backyard gardeners about. Growing up, we did have apple trees, a few apple trees and some raspberry plantings and some strawberries and stuff like that. So I have some experience starting through, and in my own home landscape, I do have a few apple trees that I currently have as well. So I'm a backyard fruit person myself as far as that goes. So when we start thinking about growing fruit at home, I start with the word passion because growing fruit is a little different than flower gardening or vegetable gardening or those kind of things, because it does take a little bit more passion in order to be successful raising fruit at home. You've got to have some enthusiasm to be able to do it, because it's not necessarily always gardening when the weather's good. It's not a middle of May through the 1st of September process, because with some of the uh, fruit that you might decide to choose to grow in your backyard, they may require more intensive spray programs, or they may require you to prune the crop in the middle of winter so that the apple trees or peach trees grow properly and can produce fruit right. So in some ways, I treat growing fruit is a little bit more of a passion than just an interest in gardening kind of a thing. When you get into growing fruit at home, something like a grapevine, if you were going to do grapes for your own wine or juice, grapevines can last 40 years, and if you don't get started with them right the first time, then they can lead to 40 years worth of problems. So doing it right, having a passion, be enthusiastic about it from year to year is something that you probably need to have when it comes to growing fruit in your own backyard. My objective today is to actually look at the challenges for growing backyard fruit in Ohio. And with hopes that once you understand the different challenges that are there, that you will be able to improve your management when possible to make your planting successful and bountiful for you. Um, you know, a lot of people say, why do you start with the bad news instead of the good news? Well, sometimes when you understand the bad news, it can help you to make better decisions, sometimes about whether you want to grow certain things in your backyard or not, because there are absolutely some fruits that work better in a backyard setting than others. This presentation isn't really going to talk a great deal about actually growing the fruit itself. But fortunately, Ohio State University Extension has a really good bulletin that's available for purchase. It's Bulletin 940. It's the Midwest Home Fruit Production Guide, done by Gary Gao and some other specialists here in the state. but Gary is our small fruit specialist and did a great job with that publication. But it's got information on growing all the standard fruits that you might in your backyard, from apples to peaches to grapes to blueberries. So really good publication, not very expensive, like $26, and you can order it and have it shipped from OSU online at that web address right there. If you don't get that written down, then just Google up Ohio State University Extension publications, and you'll find it, and then just type in Bulletin 940, and it'll be there for you at that stage of the game. So let's attack some of the challenges with growing fruit. The first challenge is really your time and your cost. It does take a little bit more time to do fruit properly than maybe some of the other things we might grow, like vegetables or some of those kind of things, because they do require a little more year-round management, from pruning to mulching to renovating once you get done. There's just a little bit more effort that kind of goes into it. It shouldn't be anything that scares you away, but if you're not willing to put the time in, so to speak, then you're not going to be very successful. A lot of times when people start thinking about fruits, they think about, I want to do an apple, or I want to do something along that line. And I would say to you that small fruits are probably a little easier to grow in many cases than tree fruits in a typical backyard setting. Raspberries and blackberries can be great, June bearing strawberries, blueberries. I mean, there's a lot of very good small fruits that fit with smaller spaces and are a little easier to manage than maybe what a fruit tree would be, that you have to stand on a ladder and you have to do some of those kind of things. You can garden at ground level, so to speak, with some of the small fruits. And they also tend to be ready earlier. You plant some strawberries in the spring, by the following year, you're in the strawberry business. Whereas with tree fruit, sometimes it can take 3 to 4 years for them to mature enough to go ahead and bear fruit. So there's a time thing that comes into play. There's definitely a cost thing that comes into play. You're going to have more equipment that you're going to need to be able to grow fruit at home. You're going to need a decent sprayer in a lot of cases, particularly if you're doing tree fruit. You can't just have one of those handheld pump ones, because you'll never get that spray all the way up into the tree to do it. So purchasing a sprayer that has a motor on it that can shoot up in the air 15 or 20 feet, so that you can actually spray a tree if you need to do it, is important. You can go to the local farm supply stores and find them. They're not all that expensive, but it is an added cost to getting into it. You're going to need a better set of pruners. You might need a decent ladder. I mean, you just more things that may come into play. You're also going to have a little more money in starting the process. I'm a big believer that you got to start with quality plants when you would do this. In part because if I put a tree in the ground, the useful life of an apple tree is 15 to 25 years. If I start with a poor quality plant, that means that I'm going to be dealing with problems for the next 15 to 25 years, and that plant may never reach its full potential just because it didn't get off to a good start. A lot of times when people decide that they're going to start with a fruit plant, they're at one of the larger stores and they see one and they decide that'd be cool to have an apple tree, so they purchase it, and then when they get it home, they figure out that all the limbs are growing straight up, and I'm going to have to retrain the limbs so that they're at the correct angle, and I'm going to have to put a whole lot of work into this tree that I saved a little money on at the beginning, but it ended up costing me more time and effort as I went into the process of it. So I'm a big believer in starting with high quality plants. There's some real good online nurseries available where you can purchase quality stuff from that end of it. I have a rule of thumb when it comes to plants. The The longer that it's going to remain in your landscape, the more money that you should spend on it when you start. So you should spend money on perennials and trees and things like that that are going to be there for a while. You can skimp a little bit when it comes to bedding plants and vegetables and some stuff like that. If you fail with them, you've got a 1 year failure, as opposed to if you fail with a perennial or a tree, you got something that you're dealing with potentially for a long period of time. So challenge number one when it comes to growing backyard fruit in Ohio is just the time and cost that's going to come into play to grow backyard fruit. Challenge number two is pest and disease control. I always like the saying of Ohio is the home of the Buckeyes, and it's also the home to many insects and diseases. Our weather conditions are really conducive for pest problems to occur. Um, you know, the winters aren't getting quite as cold as they used to, which means many of the bugs that overwinter as adults have actually survived it. We're perfect in the jet stream for bringing up diseases and insects from Florida and from the south, which is where they come from. Our high humidities in the spring and the summer are conducive for a lot of different disease problems to get started. So insects and diseases are something that we just have to realize going into it that could be a challenge for us. I had a person send me this picture of this tree, apple tree, that basically had 4 different problems on the same picture. The tree had stink bug damage, it had codling moth, it had rust, it had scab. One tree had 4 different problems, which is unusual, but not entirely uncommon that different things can attack these trees as we would work through it. So in order to have really high quality fruit, you're gonna need to have a decent spray program to be able to keep them at bay. And a spray program that starts way earlier than most people think it starts and lasts way longer than most people would think it is. Once you get to, there's some dormant sprays that we can put out. Once you get green tip and the plant starting to wake up, you're going to start spraying for diseases. You get to the middle of summer, you're going to have insect pressures. A spray program in many ways on fruit trees could be starting in April and go every 2 weeks until you harvest the fruit if you really want it to be perfect. I'd say this, there's a lot of people that have an apple tree that go spray at one time and think that they sprayed their tree. Quite honestly, that's a big waste of time and money to only spray one time. So there's a little bit of this when it comes to spray programs that you probably need to be all in or all out. And if you're all out, then you need to make sure that the trees that you plant or the things that you plant have low disease pressures or are resistant to problems like scab, so that the tree or the plant can help you to fight the problem and the spray is less important. But with that being said, organic production is really, really difficult in Ohio, particularly with a lot of the fruits. There's better options than others, June-bearing strawberries, blueberries. There's some of those that have the ability to grow organically a little bit better than maybe grapes or apples or something like that has a lot of disease and insect issues as it goes through. So if your goal is to be organic, you probably need to choose wisely as to which fruits that you decide that you're going to put in your backyard. Some of the native trees might be better options, like pawpaws. or persimmon or something like that, that maybe doesn't have quite the disease pressures that you find with some of the more traditional or well thought of kind of crops that a lot of people grow. So challenge number 2 is pest and disease control, and that you're just going to have a plan in place to try and keep them at least at a level where you aren't completely losing your crop. Challenge number 3 is wildlife. You know, you see the pictures that I've got there, and it seems obnoxious to completely net up a tree to try and keep the birds from eating all the cherries basically off the tree before you can get them harvested. But in some ways, that's not far from the truth. It's amazing how wildlife knows 2 days before you do that your fruit is ready for harvesting. So you need to be prepared to be able to manage, that wildlife to keep them out, particularly if you know in the area where you're trying to grow it that there's a lot of wildlife pressure. You can't go out there and plant a bunch of apple trees and then decide that I'm going to put a fence up to try and protect them from the deer, because the deer will figure out that you planted apple trees before you can get the fence up. You really need to exclude them before you put the time and the effort into your fruit planting, particularly in those spots where you know that you've got high pressure from wildlife. And exclusion really is the only long-term solution. Sound cannons work very briefly. Taste and smell things just have to be reapplied all the time, so they're not tremendously effective long term. So if you know you've got pressures, you know you're going to have to keep them out. Now, can I fence up a few apple trees and keep deer away from them? Sure, that wouldn't be that hard. Can I put a great big net over a standard size huge cherry tree? No, that gets to be a little bit more challenging for most people. Blueberries are one that can work well organically, but do get attacked by birds. But it would be pretty easy to put some netting over a couple of blueberry plants and keep the birds from eating them. So just understanding that wildlife can be devastating to a fruit planting means that I need to adjust my management strategy in order to keep them from taking that crop from me before I get a chance to eat it. So challenge number 3 for growing fruit in the backyard is wildlife. Challenge number 4 is cold damage, and this is winter cold damage. This is damage that during the middle of winter that the temperatures just absolutely freeze up everything that's out there. This past winter, we had a couple days that were pretty darn cold and got into the negative temperatures and actually did some damage to some plants, depending upon where you were in the state. For the most part, the state of Ohio is hardiness zone 5 or 6, depending upon where you're located. And if you look up your hardiness zone, that'll tell you what to expect for your normal coldest temperature during the winter. And in most cases, it's around 0 in Ohio anymore. It doesn't get to the negatives. So you can see on the different type of plantings, what we're talking about here is temperatures so cold that they will freeze the buds off of a dormant plant. So when we're talking about apple buds or pear buds or red raspberry buds that are out there, you get negative 30 degrees for a couple hours. In a lot of cases, those buds will freeze and fall right off the tree, and they won't provide you. In the case of the tree fruits, they're not going to provide you any more fruit for the year because they're not going to make any more buds. And it's one of the most challenging things about growing fruit at home that during these periods of cold damage or frost damage, when you lose the buds on a tree fruit, you're just not going to get any fruit for the year, and you're still going to have to manage them and keep the diseases out and those things. Now, with some of the smaller fruits that are there, that's not necessarily the case. You could still get some productivity out of it. So apples and pears are pretty hardy. And you go to the other end of the spectrum, and strawberries are probably the least hardy of what we mainly grow at -10 degrees. Knowing that we could get -10 degrees a lot of times in Ohio in different spots, we know that we have to protect strawberries and keep them insulated so that that cold can't settle into them. And we do that from a management standpoint by putting straw on them all winter long. That's the reason why you see straw there, is so that basically they don't get cold damage during the winter and lose all the buds basically off that strawberry plant. So again, cold damage can be a problem. As a backyard fruit producer, I need to realize that, and I need to do some management things to attempt to try and keep that from occurring. So it's just me adjusting my management based upon that I know it could occur. So challenge number 4 is damage that occurs during the winter because of cold. That's not the most common uh, damage that we see from a cold standpoint. The most common damage that we see is number 5, which would be frost and freeze damage during the spring. Cold weather damage that occurs after the tree has already woke up. We got it in this year here in 2020, where we had in May some very cold temperatures below 25 degrees that froze the buds off of a lot of fruit trees and fruit plantings, including all of my apples. I have no apples. I'm teaching this class. I know that it was coming, but there was realistically nothing I could do to stop it other than hope that it didn't get to where my apples were located. It did, and I have no apples on my tree in 2020 because of that fact. Once a plant wakes up, it's more susceptible. It doesn't take those negative degrees. It just takes cold for a few hours in order to do it. So in the case of apple trees, which I show the pictures of the different stages with pictures from the University of Massachusetts that they had. Green tip is when the plant is just starting to wake up. If I get to 18 degrees Fahrenheit for a couple of hours, then I'll get a little bit of kill on the tree. If it's 10 degrees at that stage of the game, then I'll lose 90% or more of the buds on the tree. Usually in Ohio, that's sometime in April is when that would typically occur, and we know that we can still get some cold temperatures in April. Half-inch green, the plant's waking up a little bit more, getting a little more exposed tissue out there, means that there can also be a little bit more damage that can occur with slightly warmer temperatures. So 23 degrees will give you a little kill, 15 degrees Fahrenheit will pretty much kill all of the buds and blooms off the plant. When you get to the bloom period, then it gets tender, really tender. 28 degrees will give you a little kill. 25 for a couple hours will basically take every bloom off that plant. And even as you take steps farther than that, when you've got fruit set and you get freezes, you can drop all the fruit off at that stage of the game as well. Why is this a problem in Ohio? Ohio's weather is really fickle, particularly with some of the changes that we had where winters aren't quite as cold as we've seen before. And we get warm spells in the middle of winter, which for a lot of us think that's a great thing, but for a fruit tree, it's not so good. Because what fruit trees do is once they go dormant, basically they build up heat within the tree or within the plant itself. And once they get to a certain level of heat buildup, then that plant wakes up. Well, if we get really warm temperatures in January, technically a plant could wake up in February when there's still a bunch of winter left. And we've had years where we've had really warm winters, and we've had trees that bloom, and it's supposed to bloom in April, that bloom in January. I had a neighbor's magnolia tree that bloomed at the beginning of January one time and basically got devastated because eventually another cold came along. So it's one of the challenges about Ohio weather is that we build heat up in the middle of the winter because when temperatures are above 50 degrees, that plant's soaking it in and that plant may start the life process a little quick. So trees and plants that bloom early really can cause us some issues. Early blooming apple varieties would be something I wouldn't necessarily recommend based upon the fact that I don't want to take a chance on this cold. Most of our peach varieties bloom pretty early. Cherries bloom pretty early. You know, with peaches, a lot of times, depending upon where you're at in the state, you know, you might get one really good crop of peaches about every 3 years based upon the freeze and frost damage that we typically see in the state of Ohio. Michigan grows great peaches. Michigan grows great peaches because it stays cold all winter long. They don't have those starts and stops of apple or peach development, which cause them to bloom too early in the season. So Ohio's weather really messes with us in the fact that we go from warm to cold to warm to cold, and that's kind of what happens to us all winter long. It's not good for apple trees as they go through. As I said with tree fruits, once you lose the bud, you're done. You're not going to get any fruit. That's not the case with strawberries or some of our smaller fruits. The interesting thing about strawberries is that they, you know, the first flowers of the year are the ones that produce the largest fruit, and there are also more flowers during that first batch. So if we can keep that first batch of flowers and fruit alive, we'll have bumper crops of strawberries. Now, if for some reason we get a freeze and we lose that first batch of strawberries and flowers, they will make another batch, but the flowers are smaller. There's fruit thus is smaller, and there tends to be less of it. So for somebody in the commercial strawberry business, they are desperate to keep those first batch of flowers alive so that they can get the big fruit that they can put 7 of them in a little basket and sell them for $4 because we're all really fired up to get some strawberries. So as a backyard grower, you got the same issue. You need to keep them alive. So what you need to do is to have that straw that we had all winter long, and you pull it off so that it gets sunlight, but you don't pull it away entirely, because if for some reason we're going to have a freeze that comes along, you can cover that plant back up and insulate it so that you don't end up losing those flowers. Strawberries work that way. Grapes work about the same way, where the first bunch of flowers is the biggest bunches, and then the next one is in the smaller bunches, and then if you lose the second batch, then grapes don't actually make more. They just start putting foliage out from that point forward. So with the small fruits, you have a little more ability to protect them from the weather than what you might have from tree fruits, which is another reason why maybe they make a little more sense sometimes in a backyard kind of a situation. So challenge number 5 was freeze or frost damage in the spring of the year once your plants have already waken up. Challenge number 6 is related to the soil. Pretty much any plant wants to grow, doesn't like to have their feet wet. But fruit plantings are particularly troublesome from that standpoint. So poorly drained soils can cause root rot, can reduce productivity, and in some cases can reduce the length of time that those trees are going to be productive. Some plants won't tolerate wet soils at all. Sweet cherries, peaches hate it. They will basically root rot and fall apart relatively early if you can't get them to do that. If you've got soils that are a little heavy and don't drain well, you know, one of the things you can clearly consider would be to put in some raised beds to improve your drainage. Particularly that's helpful for small fruits, or if you wanted to put in a small bed of blueberries or raspberries or something, you can work around some of the drainage issues that you might have from that standpoint. The other thing that we find with soil is just making sure that our soil pH is at the right level so that the plant can be successful. Blueberries require highly acidic soil, stuff down into the 4s and 5s. Most Ohio soils aren't that way unless you're in the southeastern corner, which is a great place to grow blueberries. But for me down here in southwestern Ohio, my soils are too alkaline to do it. And it can be a little bit challenging to try and fix the soils well enough for those plants to be highly productive. So if you were going to tell me that I'm going to plant an acre of blueberries on an acidic, on an alkaline soil, I might tell you good luck. If you told me that you were going to plant 3 or 4 blueberries in a small spot in your backyard, and I'd say, okay, then maybe you can do it, but you're going to have to amend the soil and fix the soil so that blueberry can thrive and be successful. So challenge number 6 is soil problems, things with poorly drained soils and pHs that don't fit for what the fruit wants. Challenge number 7 is poor pollination. Pretty much every fruit requires a pollinator to transfer pollen from the anthers, which would be the male part, down to the stigma, which is the female part, which has the ovary in it so that the fruit can be produced. The most important pollinator that we have are honeybees, and they pollinate a lot of our fruit crops that we have. There are some other alternate pollinators that might be available. Some of the solitary bees, in some cases some flies, some beetles, things like that can do it. But by far, the most important pollinator that we have are honeybees. If you don't get good pollination, you are not going to get good fruit. It's that simple. It's one of the reasons why many commercial fruit operations either are beekeepers too or contract with beekeepers to bring in hives so that they make sure that pollination occurs. Those bees need to be located relatively close. Most plants need bees. Grapes don't require bees, don't require anything for pollination for the most part, because their flower is really small and the wind and the rain will do it for them. Plants like pawpaws don't rely on bees. They actually sometimes can get pollinated by the wind and stuff, but often get pollinated by beetles and flies and stuff like that that are particularly attracted to that tree. But they still need pollination to occur. If you don't get good pollination, basically what can occur is the fruit may drop off of there. It may have a really poor shape to it and eventually fall off, or the shape could be really malformed and very unattractive. In a lot of cases, that falls off too. You get bad. The interesting thing is sometimes the fruit will begin to form on our fruit plantings, and then it all just kind of falls off, and people wonder what occurred, disease, insect, what was it? The first thing I'd always look at would be weather, and the second thing I would always look at would be whether there was good pollination. And sometimes those two things play together. Bees don't really like to travel when it's windy or rainy or issues like that. So if the time period when your plants are in flower is during really bad weather conditions, they may actually not get out there to be able to do what they need to do. So Mother Nature sometimes plays into this poor pollination as well. That happened to me 2 years ago in my apple trees, where my pollination wasn't quite as good as it possibly could have been, in part because of the bad weather conditions that didn't move my bees. From my end in my backyard, I've got about an acre and a half. I keep the backyard pretty loaded up with clover. I don't worry about it from a yard standpoint. That leaves plenty of pasture for the wild bee populations to be able to work in the hopes that they will come work my trees at the same time when they're doing it. If your landscape is pristine, it's got no flowers, it's got no bee pasture, that could be a reason why you could fail at backyard fruit, is that you just don't have enough bees working your landscape in order to do it. So you got to keep that in mind. Hopefully you got a big enough bee population that you wouldn't have to become a beekeeper, but if you want to, clearly there's a big interest in a program like that as well. The interesting thing about fruit is that fruit can be self-sterile or it can be self-fruitful. Meaning that a self-fruitful plant means that the pollen from that singular tree can pollinate that flower itself. So that plant can pollinate itself. It doesn't need cross-pollination from a different variety of apple tree in order to make that fruit. So some of them are self-fruitful, and I'll show you a list here in just a second. But there's some fruits that are self-sterile, meaning that one red delicious tree all by itself is not going to give you any fruit because the pollen is incompatible with the female part of that flower. So it won't the ovary won't develop, which means that you won't get any fruit that's going to come off of that planting. And you need to realize that when you're planting trees okay, am I planting a self-fruitful one, meaning I can do one, or am I going to do a self-sterile one, which means I need multitudes that bloom at the same time and have fertile, are compatible with each other to be able to produce that fruit. Self-sterile fruits require cross-pollination. I'll show you the list in a second, but we're talking most of the popular ones: apples, pears. The ones that you find in a lot of landscapes are actually self-sterile fruits, meaning that you need more than one variety of tree. The other thing you need to pay attention to is that there are actually some cultivars out there that have sterile pollen themselves. They can't pollinate others. Trees like winesap or Gravenstein are apple trees that have sterile pollen, meaning that they cannot serve as a pollination partner. They can take pollen from another tree, but they can't give up pollen in order to do it. So if I put a winesap out there with the Golden Delicious, for instance, the Golden Delicious could be loaded up with fruit. The winesap might not have any fruit on it, and you may decide that you want, I'm sorry, the winesap would have lots of fruit. The Golden Delicious wouldn't have any because the winesap's giving sterile fruit back. I misspoke there. So the Golden Delicious doesn't have any fruit on it. The winesap's loaded up with fruit, and all you want to do is yell at the Golden Delicious because it never gives you any apples. When the real culprit in the situation is the winesap because it's got sterile pollen. You've got to have good pollination partners there with each other that have pollen that is compatible with each other, and they bloom at the same time. That they bloom early, that they bloom same time late, that they bloom, from that end of it. So you got to pay attention to that when you're putting your fruit trees out there. Self-fruitful species, meaning I can buy one of them: peach, nectarine, apricot, grapes, brambles, raspberries, blackberries, strawberries, currants, gooseberries, tart cherries are self-fruitful. The self-sterile ones are apples and pears and plums. Sweet cherries, pawpaw, persimmon, and then your nut trees are all self-sterile as well. So when you have one that's a self-sterile one, I'm going to have to plant multiple cultivars, unless, as you see the tree that I've got up there in the picture, that's actually my tree from my house. That is a grafted fruit tree that actually has 6 different cultivars on the same trunk. So I've got pollination partners all over that tree, basically on the same tree. And you can purchase grafted fruit trees that have multiple varieties on one trunk, so that if your decision is that I only want one apple tree and I want to get apples off of it, you can buy grafted trees. If you go to many of the bigger nurseries and stuff, online nurseries, you can purchase grafted trees that have a couple of different varieties on them, so that you only need to have one tree. If you don't grow that, and they're more expensive, they are, but sometimes when you just want a little hobby like I did, you're not going to want to have to take care of 6 different trees. You only want to take care of one. In this case, I have 2 of those. A good pollination partner has fertile pollen. It has the exact same bloom time, and it's located in the same area. And by same area, the closer the better, because you're trying to get the bees to go back and forth from it. 50, 100 feet is probably about as much as I would want to stretch between pollination partners if you want to guarantee that you're going to get the best pollination that you possibly can. So that leads to this question, which would be this, is that can a crabapple tree successfully pollinate a fruit apple tree? I usually, when I teach this class live, I make people raise their hands up and say who thinks it can be so. And traditionally, the leader of the poll is that no, it can't. But when the actual answer is absolutely, a crabapple can serve as a pollinator for a fruit apple tree. In fact, they are a very good pollinator of a fruit apple tree. The advantage of crabapple, things like snowdrift, which is a really good pollination partner, is that crabapples have a longer bloom period than what fruit apple trees. Fruit apple trees maybe will bloom for a week. Crabapples will bloom for weeks and weeks, which means that there's always fresh pollen out there for the bees to go after and to work. So a crabapple can be an extremely good pollination partner. In fact, to try and improve my pollination on my 2 trees, I actually just planted a snowdrift crabapple right next to them to see if I couldn't even get more pollination than I've been getting previously. You say, okay, what's that going to do to the fruit? Well, it's not going to do anything to the fruit, because the cross-pollination is the seed that's inside the fruit. So that Golden Delicious that you see up there might have a crabapple crossed with a Golden Delicious, and it's got a seed in there that is that kind of a mix. But the covering over top of it is pure Golden Delicious. In the same way that on the crabapple, the covering, the seed might be crossed, but the covering is a crabapple covering. So you're not worried about it ruining the fruit quality. What it does, though, is points out that trying to start apple trees with seeds is generally not the way that we do it, because they're all cross pollinations. If you want to start a new tree, they do it with cuttings and off of current trees that they eventually graft onto a trunk to start a Golden Delicious tree that way, but not with the seeds. So as we kind of round up this presentation of overcoming challenges for backyard fruit production, I don't want you to go away from this thinking that it can't be done, but I do want you to go away with it realizing that all those challenges that I talked about today are real. Most of them can be overcome. Sometimes Mother Nature doesn't let us overcome some of the issues. But because of all those challenges, you've got to expect some fluctuations from year to year in fruit quantity and fruit quality, just based upon the fact that we do have a lot of disease and insect pressures, that we do have funky weather here in the state of Ohio, that we get warm temperatures and cold temperatures and weird weather throughout the year. So every year is not going to be a bumper crop when you grow backyard fruit at home. But I would say this to you: there are some things that are able to overcome some of those challenges better than others. Small fruits in the backyard are easier to manage than most tree fruits, because if you get a frost or a freeze coming, you can cover smaller plantings better than you can cover bigger plantings. They take less space, they're easier to harvest, you get fruit faster. So as opposed to just jumping to, I want a tree fruit, think about the small fruits and the raspberries, the blackberries, the strawberries, blueberries, some of those that may fit better in your situation. There's no question that you can grow some tree fruits here. Apples work well. Pears are okay. Plums are okay. Peaches would be fine as long as they don't get froze off. You know, cherry trees get to be a little bit of challenge because of the birds. And sweet cherries really don't like to have their feet wet. So in heavier soils like ours in southwestern Ohio, tart cherries might be a better choice. But with all of those things, maybe some of the natives, which go native is a big topic that a lot of people are talking about with their landscape plants and stuff. But you can go native with fruit trees. Pawpaw, persimmon, mulberry are all native fruit trees that in many ways require a little less management and can withstand some of the challenges that Ohio brings better than maybe some of those more traditional tree fruits that you might think of. So there's plenty of options. You know, realize that it's not going to be perfect every year. Realize that small fruits might work better in a lot of cases in small backyards. Realize that I can do tree fruits, that I might have to spray them. I'm going to have to prune them. I'm going to have to do some of those things. And maybe the natives might be a little easier to manage. But as I go back to my first slide that I brought you, if you have a passion to do it, there is no question that we can grow fruits in the backyard in Ohio. We just have to work through some of those challenges. So there's my contact information. If you have questions about this presentation, you can email me and I'd be more than willing to respond to you. Pretty much every county in the state of Ohio has an extension educator. So if you're in a county ways away from me and you wanted to talk to your educator about growing backyard fruit, I'm sure that they would be more than willing to help you. I'm going to stop sharing my screen at this stage of the game and come back to you and say thank you for participating in the virtual farm science review and the Utzinger Garden Talks. And we look forward to 2021 when we can get together in person and have this conversation. Thanks and have a great afternoon.